Welcome back. I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Review. Here we are again with another of my designs. This one's from 7 years ago. The title was distinctly different and we had 70 centimetres of width to use. Height was unlimited, judged from the front, and it had to be in contemporary style. Now previously I've talked about the difference between modern and contemporary because it can be very confusing. So modern designs are those that were reflecting the design trends of the 60s, 1960s and 1970s and a little bit of the 1980s, and everything after that became contemporary. So contemporary really means of the time. So what is prevalent, what is interesting, what is the design trend of this particular time. So it would be different every year. So if we're thinking 7 years ago, this was when we were first allowed in some places to use paper as part of a design, and it would count towards the plant material because it was derived from a plant material. Now this is a debate that continues to this day as floral art and design has moved from being purely traditional flowers and foliage arrangements into something that incorporates a lot of other mediums. The debate continues about how much you can use that is plant-derived material rather than straight plant material. And so I'd be interested if you yourselves have come across this dilemma in your own competitions, or whether you find that it is quite well explained in the show schedules before you make your competition pieces. So leave me a comment if you've come across this in your travels, and if not, it'll be interesting to read what others have experienced in this field. But as I said, this one was, we were allowed to use paper as part of the design. Couldn't be the dominant part of the design, but we could certainly use it as part of the design. So what I've got there is that the stand is actually a very heavy weight that is a counterbalance weight of a telescope that is no longer in use, and so it's a nice solid piece of metal that will sit very comfortably on the show bench without moving at all. I've drilled a hole in the base of a piece of wood that is very textured. You won't see it in this image unless you zoom out the image, but it's got quite wonderful striations all over the outside of this timber, and I sort of kept it because I knew that one day I'd be able to use it. So it's an interesting piece of timber. The top of it I've drilled some more holes, and into those holes I've glued some paper covered wire. And that's why I've got such perfect arcs and circles with the wire, because I can bend it to shape. And onto those I've drilled some holes in some tin discs and threaded them on at different angles. And I wanted it to have no plant material in it because that, for me, is what would make it distinctly different, that there was not a flower to be seen, not a bit of foliage to be seen, but it was all still plant material. So the design placed second in the competition, and I'm going to talk a little bit after I've gone through the analysis. I'm going to talk a little bit about that result and what that triggered in me as a result of this particular competition. So let's now have a look at our AI Design Eyes analysis of the design and the suggestions for improvement. Line, first of all, line is the absolute hero of this composition. The thin arching stems bursting from the top create a sweeping kinetic trajectory that draws the eye out and downward. Try saying that fast a couple of times. So what it's talking about in the stems there are actually that paper covered wire, but it sees it as stems because it looks like, from the image, it looks like it's plant material. And that is, in terms of line, it is very much a line design because all you see are the lines that are created by the plant material that is placed there, whether it's the timber, the paper covered wire or the discs. They're all forming a line of some description in the design. Form, there is a severe contrast in form. The heavy solid cylindrical mass of the textured wood stands in stark opposition to the airy, open, floating forms of the circular discs. And it's an interesting analysis because I don't think I really put any thought into the form other than thinking at the time I was putting it together that the timber is circular by nature, and that the discs are also circular by nature, and so there was that repetition of form that I felt was comfortable, and that's why I used the round base as well, because once again, if it was on a square base, it wouldn't look anywhere near as complete a design as it does with the circular base, the circular timber, the arcs of the paper covered wire, and then the circular timber discs on the wire itself. So it's that repetition of form that is helping create rhythm in the design. Texture. The visual interest is heavily driven by the deep gnarled swirling texture of the central wooden column. This rugged surface contrasts sharply with the flat, smooth, machine finish of the wooden discs at the end of the stems. So whilst, as you know if you've looked at any of the videos, texture is my go-to place for contrast and visual interest, in this case, because the line is so strong in terms of the principles and elements of design, and because the form is repeated quite strongly as well, texture doesn't have to play as big a part in this design. There is textural contrast there, but the overall impression that you get is not about the textural contrast, it's about the line and about the form. Space. The design masterfully uses negative space. The sweeping canopy of stems embraces a large volume of empty air, making the piece feel expansive and dynamic despite using very little actual material. And this is what I've tried to talk about in other videos, about the space between your placements is part of the design. And so what we don't see a timber upright and then all those different arms, we see that as a whole design, because our eyes are encouraged to embrace the whole of that design, including the space between the various parts of the design. Colour. The palette is entirely monochromatic, relying on earthy browns and tans. In contemporary design, removing colour distraction forces the viewer to focus entirely on structure and form. And so that's what I've done by not distracting you with colour. You are forced to think about this design in terms of the line and of the form, which we've talked about already. Contrast. The entire design is an exercise in extremes: heavy versus light, thick versus thin, textured versus smooth, and static versus dynamic movement. So the contrasts are there, but there's not one thing that contrasts more than another. And so once again, we've got this whole design incorporating the principles and elements of design and bringing together all of those things into a unified framework that when we look at it, we think that it's distinct, that it's different. And is it distinctly different? Well, it's distinctly different in terms of those things, in terms of those contrasts and of the lack of colour in the design that makes it different to anything else that you might see in a floral art piece. Balance. The piece utilises daring asymmetrical balance. The dense visual and physical weight of the upright log is counterbalanced by the long leveraged reach of the thin stems. The visual tension comes from wondering how it remains standing. The actual tension at the time was created by wondering if it will stand, but it did, and I had practiced it beforehand, so I knew that it would stand. Because basically, even though the stems on the right-hand side arc a long way out, when given that that's a 70 centimetre width that we're looking at, because they're so light and because they're curved back in, the gravitational balance is still centred on that log, which is on that heavy base, and the base, as I said at the beginning, is so very heavy, weight-wise, physical weight-wise, that I knew that I would be able to have things hanging over away from it, and it would still balance itself in the long run. Rhythm. The wooden discs act as visual punctuation marks. Their suspension at varying heights creates a staccato, cascading rhythm that slows the viewer's eye as it travels down the arching lines. Now, this is one of the things that I was very careful about in terms of placement. You know, we often look at a design like this and we think, oh, it's very simple, it must have been easy to put together. But it's the actual thinking about where your eye travels. You have to be so precise about the placement of everything in a design. So very much like Ikebana, where you look at those Ikebana designs and you think they're quite simple and straightforward, but everything is measured in terms of its placement and how it fits with the rest of the design. And so when I was putting the discs on, I was very deliberate about where I placed them in the length of the stems and where in the curve of the stems they were being placed. So they were never right at the end, and they were, sometimes there was one, sometimes there was two. So once again, that's different to the placements that we would normally have, the three, the odd numbers, the threes and the fives. So everything had a purpose in this design and everything was placed deliberately in the design. So dominance and emphasis. The heavily textured vertical column dominates the lower half of the design, acting as the anchor point from which energy of the piece explodes outward. Very true, and I probably didn't look at it in those terms so much as I just wanted that the curve that started to show in that top piece of the timber to be reflected in the smaller placements to bring it back, bring your eye back around and down. And it's a very fine line, because if you looked at this design for too long, you would think that that log is far too dominant in the whole of the design because there's so little in the rest of the design. But because of the size, the relative size of the placement of those arcs, I've managed to incorporate, as we said, that negative space, and so it brings it back into feeling that that whole of that right-hand side is matched in terms of its size by the solid dominance of the smaller, in relative terms, placement of the log on the left-hand side. So let's now have a look at some of the suggestions to see what I could do with this design to bring it up to a different level. First of all, the visual grounding. While the mechanics are clearly sound, the very small, dark cylindrical base creates a slight sense of visual instability. A wider, flatter base, perhaps a matte black or a textured metal square, might ground the heavy wooden column more securely to the eye without detracting from the minimalist aesthetic. Now, it's not talking about physical balance here, it's talking about visual balance and visual grounding. And I think the problem is not so much the base, yes, a wider, flatter base, but I think also had I brought the timber, the large piece of timber further down, so not had so much of the metal rod showing, that might help it as well. And perhaps what I could have done is wrap some jute or something that matched the paper on the wire on the other side, match that along the length of that rod underneath, so it wasn't the base and then the rod, which is quite dominant. It is quite a high base, and I can understand why that might detract from the design. And perhaps even if I had covered the base with hessian, I wouldn't go for a square or a textured metal square, because I think that would detract from the movement of the design, as I said earlier. So I would still want a round base, but I might think about covering the base with some other plant-based material like hessian or jute to keep the colours in the same framework, but to incorporate the log a little bit more into that base area of the design. The point of emergence. The junction where the thin arching stems exit the top of the heavy log feels a bit abrupt. Softening this transition slightly, perhaps with a very tight, minimal collar of a transitional texture, or carving the wood so the stems appear to be growing from deeper within a crevice, could make the connection feel more organic and deliberate. wouldn't like to add any more material into the design, basically. I want it to be as minimalist as I possibly can. And so I think probably the idea of carving that top so that they all look like they were coming out of the same point, I think is a good idea, because it refines the top part of that design, refines the placement of those elements in the design, and it would look like they were bursting out, and it would tie in the discs a little bit more into the design, because they would look like they had been pushed out by this bursting out that had happened with the paper covered wire. So I think I'd probably try refining the top, so bringing it a bit closer into the point of emergence for all of the wire to come out of the one point. Number 3, directional tension. All the sweeping lines fall beautifully to the right. Introducing just one subtle shorter line or element breaking away in the opposite direction could amplify the dynamic tension and emphasize the contorted energy of the main piece of wood. I'm going to say no. I don't want to destroy the line and the movement and the flow of this design by trying that out. I can see my feeling is that if I put anything going in the other direction, then you'd be drawn out there and you'd be left stuck out there, and it would detract from the rest of the design, which is so strong in its form and its line and placements. So that's a suggestion I'm not going to take on board, but thank you for sharing it with me anyway. Now, I want to go on and talk to you about why this design was pivotal in my floral art journey. I have always designed a little bit differently to the bulk of the people that I compete with and against. And increasingly, over the years that I've been involved, and it's more than 20 years now, we have had less and less feedback from judges. And some of that is because competitors were not considerate in their reactions to the judging, and they argued, and in one case I know it took to extremes and court cases were threatened. But you know, when it's all said and done, this is an art form, and the judging, when we compete, we accept that judging is going to be at a particular level using particular rules, but it always comes back to the principles and elements of design. Unfortunately, what happens when you compete in the same groups and in the same areas and you're exposed to the same judges is that they get to know your work, unless you do something very different, like in this case, because what happened at the end of this competition, when the judges came around and were doing general feedback, they didn't do it specifically, but when they came to this class and the judge was talking about this class and how they had all the designs were different, and that the first place one was different because of the placement of the flowers that had been used in it, and then went on to this one and started to talk about how this one was very distinctly different because of the lack of floral material, but the judge felt that it just lacked some visual balance, which is interesting when we've heard this analysis. And then she turned to me and she said, "I couldn't believe that you had done this." And I thought, why did you feel a need to tell me that? And do you prejudge? You know, my automatic reaction was that you must be prejudging the things. And now I've had other instances where judges come up to me and said, "Oh, you did well in this class." And I said, "I didn't enter that class." "Oh, I thought that one was yours. I thought that was definitely yours." And I thought, prejudging yet again. And so it led me to start thinking about how could we have a completely independent judge look at our designs, whether it was for competition or whether it was just as part of our educational journey. And so that this, in fact, was the beginning of my path for Floral Art Online and for Floral Art Review. And so I have come now to a point where, as many of you know, we are running regional and global competitions online, where our AI design eye is judging and assessing and analysing and sending feedback. And from all of the feedback that we get, from the feedback that gets sent out, from the results and from the designs that are submitted just for purely interest, is that what people are getting is really, really useful and really helping them. And as you know, as I go through these every week, I find that this gives me some ideas and it gives me help to understand what I could have done better when I look at it with someone's independent eyes telling me exactly in terms of the principles and elements of design what I need to do or what I did right, what I could have improved, what is outstanding in the designs. So I encourage you to think about submitting your designs, whether it's just for competition practice or whether you're not interested in competition at all and you just want to know something about your design and how it fits in terms of the broader floral art schema, then Floral Art Review is the place for you to go. And you'll see the website. You just go there and follow the instructions there. It will give you the rundown on what you need to do and how you need to submit a photo. And then within seconds, literally within less than a minute, you will have the results. And it comes out in the same format as this. It's there on the screen for you to access whenever you like. And it doesn't disappear unless you close your account. And the image is there, the rundown against the principles and elements of design is there, and then there are suggestions for you in terms of that particular design. So it's so useful for you in terms of your floral art journey that I really hope that you take the opportunity to use it to help you on your way. Now that I have done my spiel, I will leave you for this week. I'm Kim Bailey, and this is Floral Art Review.